In today's video, I'm going to be installing my intake manifold. I already have the engine prepped for me to install the intake manifold prior to this video starting. So make sure before you start this that the mating surfaces are cleaned prior to installing the intake manifold. That is the most important part of this job, is making sure that the mating surfaces are clean so you can apply the RTV for the manifold gaskets. Right here I am installing the RTV on the water intake ports. That's pretty much where the coolant comes out of the intake into the engine. I'm applying the blue RTV because the blue RTV is for coolant only. I know some guys just use the ultra gray all around, but every time I do these, older techs have told me to use the correct color RTV so that it works properly. And then here I'm applying the ultra gray for the ports where oil comes out of. Ultra gray always works for me. Some guys use the black RTV, but I use ultra gray. Most guys use ultra gray nowadays. It pretty much stops any leaks. It's a great RTV sealant. My next step right here is installing the Felpro gaskets for the intake manifold. Before I install the intake manifold itself, just make sure you place these on here correctly. They can only go on one way, and just make sure you get them lined up correctly so that way that the RTV can seal along with the gasket itself. Then the next step right here is a crucial part of this job. Right here, you need to make a thick bead for this mating surface right here, because this is where one of the first leaks that this intake always has on these small block engines. Make sure the bead is thick on the front and back of the intake manifold. Make sure that you make the thick bead stretch from each ear of the gaskets. So start the bead right at the gasket to the left, and then make sure you make it run all the way to the other gasket on the other side. Off camera, I applied RTV to the bottom portion of the intake manifold. You really could just retrace the intake manifold gaskets with RTV and it would accomplish the same thing. Once the intake manifold is installed, make sure that the bolt holes on the manifold are lined up correctly, so that way you can make sure that the gaskets are still in the same spot once you have installed the manifold. Once you have the intake manifold lined up, then you just install the bolts that go into the intake manifold that connected to the engine. I would start the bolts by hand, not with a ratchet. Once again, just to make sure you're properly in the holes correctly and the gasket with the intake manifold is lined up. You really want to make sure that the gasket for the intake manifold is lined up with it itself, or it could create premature leaks.
One more quick tip while installing the manifold. It would be best if you apply the RTV to the intake manifold bolts. If you apply the RTV to the threads, that will also additionally help stop any leaks. Just make sure you don't apply too much because it will block up the oil passages and it will mess up the oil pressure flow of the engine. But it is good to apply some RTV to the threads of the intake manifold bolts, as it also helps stop any unnecessary leaks. Once you have all the bolts installed into the intake manifold, you can go ahead and start tightening them down like I am doing here. I like to do it in a crisscross pattern from the farthest bolts apart. So I'll go from the top left to the bottom right, from the top right to the bottom left, and then I'll just follow the same sequence with the other bolts. Just make sure to go crisscross back and forth as you see, like I'm doing right here. So that way you don't get one side torqued down farther than the other. It's more of a better sequence to get an even surface for the manifold to be tightened down to the gaskets and the engine. For the two middle bolts on the intake manifold, you will need a wobble socket or a wrench, which is more preferred, to get those tightened down. And then when you go to torque them down, you really won't be able to torque them down. Just make sure you get them pretty snug as much as you can.
I wasn't able to record it on camera, but after I snugged up all of the intake manifold bolts, I did go back behind myself and torque the bolts to torque spec with a torque wrench. The torque specs for each bolt is 30 foot-pounds. And once again, I did it in the crisscross position from the top left to the bottom right, so forth. Just how you saw me tighten it down with the ratchet. And they were all snug and they were all good to go. And that is how I installed the intake manifold on my small block Chevy engine. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe this video for future content.